the Emperor Saloninus. I find him difficult to rank. I appreciate when we talk about him, we're basically talking about Silvanus, his regent. From what I understand, he was a very competent and loyal commander. The Rhine was largely secured by him, and also when rebellion did break out, he remained loyal to Saloninus and Gallienus, rather than join the posthumous revolt. I can't remember why Posthumus revolted.
Basically because, and this is why I'd regard Saloninus, well, I guess I'd regard him as a poor emperor, because this is literally the one thing he's recorded as doing, and it resulted in his overthrow. But I also think he had good reason to do it, so I wouldn't say so. But okay, so we know that a bunch of Germans, probably Franks, had penetrated deep into Gaul and were returning. And so Silvanus was the guardian of Saloninus, and Posthumus was the general of the Rhine frontier. It looks as though what happened was Posthumus waited for these Franks to return to the Rhine frontier to get back across. Posthumus attacked them and defeated them. Then he started distributing the plunder that had been captured by the Franks to the troops. Now Silvanus and Saloninus, well, Saloninus with Silvanus's de facto decision-making or guidance, they decided that the plunder shouldn't be distributed to the troops, but should be returned to the people of Gaul, because, and with good reason, I guess, because they had been, this is plunder, this isn't, plunder taken from German villages. This is plunder taken from Roman citizens by the Franks that, in an ideal world, would be returned to them. But the problem is, because Posthumus had already perhaps knowingly, made this power move of distributing, without imperial consent, distributing the plunder to the soldiers, it therefore was going to look really bad when Saloninus and Silvanus try to confiscate the plunder that had just been distributed to the troops. Yeah, and so in a way, Posthumus perhaps deliberately entrapped them. But the reason why Saloninus and Silvanus would do this is, I guess, it's morally good. But in this period, it's also just a bad political miscalculation. So that's essentially why I'd regard him as a poor emperor, because ultimately that decision got him killed. And perhaps should have predicted that would be the case.
I think it's ironic that 8 years later, Posthumus is killed for a very similar reason.
Yes.
Mainz rebels, and then they take it, and then Posthumus tries to stop them sacking the city, and then they murder him.
It's the exact same mistake. Yeah, it's very ironic. The only emperor in the period who managed to do something like that and not get killed for it is Aurelian.
Yeah.
And that was Tiana, which I guess we'll get to, but, it's the whole... Well, we'll get to it. But he managed to pull it off.
By the skin of his teeth, by the sounds of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think incompetent.
Sure.
Yeah, sometimes discretion is the better part of valor.
Yes.
Gallienus is a very interesting emperor to me. I'm tempted to put him in good, actually. If you look at the face of it, his reign sees the Roman Empire reach its worst situation ever since it became a superpower. Gaul, with Posthumus and the death of Saloninus, you've got Gaul, Spain, and Britain join Posthumus in rebellion. The east is almost overrun by Chapo, and it's only saved by Odenathus, who basically becomes the supreme commander of the east for Gallienus.
Yeah, it kind of becomes a viceroy.
The Balkans are many major cities are sacked, like Byzantium. His family all dies off, and then he's murdered in 268 after having fought off a slew of usurpers. But you also have a lot of things happen during his long reign. I think he's the longest reigning emperor since Septimius Severus, from 253 to 268, which in this period...
This is amazing, really.
This period, it's almost like a lifetime. He has a lot of initiatives during his reign. and you see a lot of things start to change, which you eventually see them come to their fruition in the under Diocletian and in the 4th century. So Gallienus stops appointing senators. The Senate is almost completely cut out of his reign in any role. He starts appointing equestrians. So the equestrians were the lower aristocracy from the provinces rather than the Senate and senatorial families.
It also makes it easier for career officers to enter the equestrian order. So he's sort of pushing up this particular class of equestrians, these experienced military professionals, into these military commands.
There had been previous emperors that had started to promote equestrians, like Gordian III, and Timotheus was a equestrian.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's Gallienus that really pushes the equestrians, and at the exclusion of the Senate, which has the effect that he gets the worst write-up of any of the emperors from this period, pretty much. He's described as being lazy and incompetent and a good for nothing, basically. And then they go on to describe all of his good deeds.
There's just this ongoing cliche of the lazy Gallienus, sort of effeminate lazy Gallienus.
You then read other accounts like the life of Plotinus, which only has good things to say about Gallienus and gives you an insight into not only was he beginning to reform the army and the frontiers and so on, but also he was a great patron of the arts during his reign. There is a story retold in the life of Plotinus, written by Porphyry, who's a later pagan philosopher, where Plotinus approaches Gallienus and asks him to give him a city which he can run in the style of Plato's Republic. And Gallienus is almost on board with the idea, but is talked out of it right at the last minute. But it gives you the kind of impression that Gallienus is a little like Hadrian in a way, in that he is looking at kind of art and religion and doing things to patronize it and promote it, and is interested in this stuff. I mean, some people call it the Gallienic Renaissance.
Yeah, fascinating.
And also there's a change in sculpture for Gallienus, in that his eyes are always looking up at heaven rather than straight ahead. He starts to look a little bit more like how emperors are portrayed under Diocletian and later, and that is a completely unnatural, idealized version of them rather than the more natural peak performance of natural. You know, it's like you look at someone like Septimius, a bust of Septimius Severus, and he looks very realistic and very almost true to life. And then you look at starting with Gallienus and then especially the Tetrarchy, where they're completely featureless and their eyes are bulging out of their skulls and so on.
Gallienus' later sculptures seem to sort of combine. It's not at that abstract level that we get with the Tetrarchs yet, but it has the eyes looking upwards combined with a sort of Alexandrian, he's got the Alexandrian hair and Hellenistic heroism, but slowly kind of showing the way to the very typically late antique symbolism that these sculptures end up having.
And he enacts some military reforms, the most famous of which is that he forms a cavalry corps. The Romans did, of course, use cavalry before this, but it was very small in scale. And Gallienus is the first to have a elite cavalry corps that goes with him. It's almost like a proto army in the emperor's presence that you'll see under the late Roman military system. And also strategy begins to change. I think it had already started to change under Valerian, but you really see it in Gallienus's reign, in that there's more of what's described as an elastic defense. So rather than trying to take out the barbarians at the frontiers, which by this point had pretty much all collapsed, and the Hadrianic defenses have been completely overrun, you have the army centered, in Gallienus's case, in Milan. And then when the enemy attack, he rides out to meet them, and as they're starting to head back to wherever they came from, he attacks them and decimates them, and then that's that threat gone. The only trouble
Yes.
with that is that they've already pillaged and plundered their way through half the countryside by that point. For the victims of barbarian attack, it's not that great, but militarily, you start to see the empire really starting to get to grips with the barbarian invasions going on. So, like, there's a battle at Nasus against the Goths, which Gallienus wins. It's a big victory. That it doesn't crush the Goths, but it's a really major victory. And it's from this point onwards, under Gallienus, Claudius II, Aurelian, that you start seeing major victories being won against various barbarian and also rebel groups. They're taken out one by one, whereas before they were kind of pushed off or defeated the Roman forces. So the countryside by the end of the day is completely devastated, but they are starting to have more military success. So
yes, I view him. I'd go so far as to call him a great emperor. I think, there's my only criticism of him is the obvious one, that he failed to reunify the empire. But I think the only emperor in this period who was going to pull that off, at least in the 260s, at the height of this crisis, you needed someone like an Aurelian to pull that off. Gallienus is he does what he can, and he does a pretty good job of it. He seems to be kind of, for 8 years there, he's the ultimate survivor, those 8 years between his father's capture and his own assassination, where, his father's capture just causes this massive, it just turns up the notch on this crisis in a huge way.
yeah, we have the rebellion of Macrianus, don't you?
Yes. Yeah, that's it. I mean, we've got so many at once. We've got Posthumus on the Rhine. We've got Macrianus and his two sons in the east. We have Ingenuus in Pannonia, who is then taken out, but then another usurper, Regalianus, makes a move. I mean, when Macrianus is taken out and his sons are defeated, there is another Aemilian takes power in Egypt, and he seems to have been a loyalist of the Macriani, and he has to get defeated. Gallienus sends this admiral, Theodotus, to get rid of him. There's also a couple of usurpers who might be unhistorical, but we are told of Piso in Thessaly and Valens in Greece. Valens was sent against Piso by Macrianus, and Piso was a loyalist of Gallienus, but then they both become usurpers. So that might be unhistorical, but it does sort of reflect just how insane this period was. Gallienus, even before 260, really forces him to be this great emperor, in my opinion. Even before that, he's the more energetic of the two, I'd say, when it comes to Valerian. Like, he from circa 254 to 256, he's stationed on the middle Danube, and that's possibly the original context of this cavalry, this sort of cavalry-heavy central army the central reserve that he creates. It may have been in the context of dealing with Vandal, because we know that there was archaeology shows that Pannonia suffered pretty badly in this period, and so maybe in that context that Gallienus developed this army where, because the frontiers were running out of troops. Dacia, for example, was at about half strength by this point. And so Gallienus has this central reserve that allows him to, as you say, it's not great for the inhabitants, who are, no matter what they're going to get, they're going to suffer. But at the very least, these raiders can then get rounded up by this quicker moving, smaller reserve army that makes heavy use of cavalry and also vexallations of infantry, and is able to round them up. It's also an army that is better able to deal with threats like Persian cataphracts and Sarmatian cataphracts and various, Gothic cavalry. It's becoming increasingly the case that a bit more effort on the cavalry, in terms of cavalry, is increasingly necessary, and Gallienus seems to recognize that. And so, 254 to 256, he's dealing with Vandals and Sarmatians. 257 to 259, he's dealing with the Franks. He then has to go to Italy to deal with this big Alemannic invasion of Italy and defeats them outside Milan. Then his father gets captured, and that causes all these other issues to occur. And he rapidly defeats Ingenuus. We're told that he did some kind of outflanking maneuver with his cavalry. So the reforms paid off even against the usurper.
I think the only person that defeats him is Postumus. Gallienus attacks him, or he sends Aureolus to attack Postumus, and Postumus defeats him. And then Gallienus just stations troops on the frontier to keep an eye on Postumus, but basically leaves him to it.
He seems to have made a couple of attempts. So we know that he appears to have retaken Rhaetia quite early in Postumus's usurpation. Gallienus appears to have wrested control of Rhaetia from Postumus, and that's a very important sort of strategic gain. It's a good defensive buffer.
What's the way into the Alps? Which is the way into Italy, you say?
Yes,
to protect Rome.
Yes, and it's a place where you wouldn't want a bunch of legions loyal to Postumus sitting directly to the north of Italy. He then does he defeats Ingenuus, and then I think his general Aureolus defeats Regalianus, the other usurper in Pannonia, and then Aureolus defeats Macrianus. And then he makes his move against Postumus into Gaul proper. And yes, he appears to have suffered an initial defeat to Postumus, but then defeated him, and then sent Aureolus to pursue him. And I think Zonorus says that Aureolus, through laziness, failed to capture Postumus, and thus failed to put the nail in the coffin. And then there was another campaign. We don't really know the years involved in these campaigns, but we know that Postumus, was able to recover because they didn't manage to capture him. And so then Gallienus managed to again defeat Postumus and besiege him in a city where the city isn't named. And on that occasion, Gallienus suffered an arrow. He got hit by an arrow and was badly wounded. And so then he withdrew. And it seems that the siege was ultimately called off, and thus Postumus managed to get yet another chance to survive. So here he was unable to he seems to have kind of repeatedly gotten the better of Postumus, but couldn't quite finish him.
Yeah.
One great anecdote in Peter the Patrician, and you can totally see why Gallienus would do this, because his son, Saloninus, had been killed by Postumus. He supposedly offered to single combat Postumus. I love that. It just makes sense, because poor Gallienus would be such a frustrated, grief-stricken, he had good reason to be frustrated and angry. I mean, so meanwhile, while all this is happening, he also has to deal with Goths and Heruli, who are now really ratcheting up. They've really amped up.
Pushing into the Balkans.
Yes, and the Aegean and Asia Minor. And so he has to deal with that. And there's an indication that the garrison in Byzantium let the Goths through and were rebelling themselves. And on that occasion, Gallienus clearly just fed up. Because it also looks like from the chronology, Lucas Dubois points this out, that it looks like from the chronology that this is another reason why he probably had to put off one of his campaigns against Postumus, was he had to turn back to deal with these Goths and also the city of Byzantium. And he persuaded the garrison to surrender, but then he disarmed them and massacred them, because clearly he'd had enough.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he got
not be tolerated.
Yeah, he got brutal there, but I guess I can see why at this point. But yeah, so I think militarily, he does a hell of a job of surviving. He was loved by his soldiers, which is rare for the period, because when he was eventually assassinated by a cabal of senior officers, for reasons that aren't recorded, well, again, in that context, he was being militarily successful because he actually, as you mentioned, he defeated the Heruli and the Goths in a battle on the river Nessos, and then he had to return to Italy because his longtime general Aureolus actually turned against him and seized control of Milan, Gallienus's base of operations, and invited Postumus into northern Italy, but Postumus didn't accept the invitation, probably because Postumus understood it was better to be on the defensive when it came to his wars with Gallienus, rightly so. And Gallienus showed up, again defeated Aureolus, just like everyone else he ever came up against generally, and besieged him in Milan. But at that point, his senior officers, for reasons unclear, assassinated him. The one theory is that because so many of them were these Balkan officers. They were upset that the war against the Goths had to be temporarily abandoned. When that happened, though, we're told the soldiers got very upset and that Claudius had to grant an exceptionally generous donative to them, keep them happy, Claudius being, Gallienus' successor. The Senate, meanwhile, because they hated Gallienus for his policies that kind of worked against the Senate, were massacring his supporters in Rome. But then Claudius actually sent them an edict ordering them to stop because it was upsetting the soldiers. But those are the words used. I don't remember which ancient historian says that, but I think it's Aurelius Victor, that it was upsetting the soldiers and so that they should stop massacring his supporters. A different source shows that Claudius, well, we know that he deified Gallienus and also continued building this very large statue of Gallienus in the city of Rome. So clearly Claudius understood that Gallienus was someone who was popular among the army, was popular among the people of Rome, where the statue was being built. Yeah, he was respected. And I guess you can see why. I mean, so yeah, his reforms, you said, we've talked about the cavalry army.
He issued an edict of toleration for the Christians to end Valerian's persecution.
Oh, yeah.
Which,
yes.
Well, it mimics Constantine and Licinius to no end, in that you've had this big persecution to try and get rid of the Christians. And then his solution to the problem is just grant them toleration and let them get on with it and not make an issue of this thing that doesn't have to be an issue.
Yeah, I think he realized how destructive it was being, I guess, because he needed all the support he could get. And
it paid dividends for him in some regards for the Christians, because I remember in Eusebius's account, Gallienus gets a flowing write-up from him. It's like, yes, Gallienus, he was like a mini Constantine, and he granted us toleration, and Christians prayed to him for many years to come, and stuff like that. Not only does it get him brownie points for the Christians, but it also gets rid of unnecessary internal conflict, which he really doesn't need at the moment. And
it's a necessary antidote in the sources to have that, because, as you say, the Senate hates him. That's it. From a historiographical perspective, Gallienus, it's natural that Gallienus became one of the most hated emperors in history. A, because the Senate didn't like him, and the aristocrats are writing the history. B, he was ruling when the empire, not through his fault, just started really fragmenting. And C, actually later emperors, such as the Tetrarchs, use Gallienus's association with Crisis as a kind of byword for their superior leadership. So panegyrics in the Tetrarchic period, one of them does refer to, the orator says something along the lines of, when the empire seemed to be about to collapse during the reign of Gallienus, whether through bad luck or his fault. So the orator sort of doesn't commit to that. But he's using that as sort of a contrast with the restoration of the empire under the Tetrarchs, sort of, erasing everything good that happened in between the Tetrarchic period and Gallienus. But yeah, I think, his reforms, Caelan Davenport, he puts out a theory on why Gallienus wasn't appointing senators as military commanders. And yeah, he thinks that, there's a lot of debate about why he was doing this. I think that clearly a big part of it is career officers make for good generals. But also, Caelan makes the very good point. It's a dark point to consider, but by this point in time, the number of experienced senatorial generals must be low, because there's been serious defeats against the Goths, against the Persians. Legionary fortresses have been captured in Syria and Mesopotamia. A bunch of them have gone over to Postumus's side. So he can't have much trust over the remaining experienced senatorial generals, because all of these previous usurpers have tended to be senatorial. It's only later, with the kind of advent of these soldier emperors, that we start seeing soldier emperor usurpers. Although Postumus is one such example of that. Also, he probably didn't have many experienced men left from the Senate, so he needed to rely on experienced career officers to fill those boots. So it makes a lot of sense, probably. He has this reputation as a bit of an intellectual when we look hard enough for it. It is there, it's hidden under all the vitriol.
Yeah.
But, he was a cultured person. He he was initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries in Greece.
By Hadrian.
Yeah. So he is a bit of a Hadrianic figure in that sense. He's changing his image as well to be more of a divine emperor, thus the eyes looking up to heaven. Coins start talking about various gods, I think in particular it's Soule, but I think also to a degree Jupiter, as the conservator, the preserver of the emperor, which is paving the way to Aurelian and Diocletian and their use of the gods for their own legitimation. He made very good use of subordinates, because we know of Aureolus being this, until the last year, a trusted general. I mean, Odaenathus. So Odaenathus was clearly a bit of a rogue, but Gallienus, I guess, had the forethought, now was not the time to start a war with Odaenathus. That Odaenathus could be used as a viceroy, as a de facto ruler of the East. As long as Odaenathus continued to recognize Gallienus as the emperor, and he did, that he could
vice versa.
So
there's no use starting a war with Rome when Persia's breathing down his neck, and everything to gain from remaining loyal to the emperor, but still having all of this power he can wield in the East.
And I think from both of their perspectives, that's a rare example of, really thinking things through, where, Gallienus hasn't set up a family member as this overlord of the East or anything to kind of replace Valerian. It's Odaenathus has sort of taken this role in a way that transcended Gallienus's plans. But Gallienus has the good sense to realize, well, with everything going on, let's not start a war with Odaenathus. Let's use him. And, if it eventually gets to the point where he's too powerful, we can cross that bridge when we have to. And I'll say he made good use of diplomacy as well, because the Franks, there was some prominent Frankish leader who was at that Gallienus allied with as a friend against the more hostile Germans along the Rhine.
Isn't this where the story of his second wife Pippa comes from?
Well, and that's, where he also has an example of him making an alliance with a Marcomannic leader, Attalus. And Attalus' daughter was someone named Pippa, who, the sources frame it as being a second wife to Gallienus. Perhaps she was just more of a consort. But it is providing this window into Gallienus the diplomat as well.
Yeah.
So I'd say he was a great emperor. I think he was just ruling in the worst time to be an emperor.
Well, I almost think that has something to his credit, that despite all of this happening, and a lot of his predecessors, like Decius, had tried and failed to come to grips with the problem, Gallienus tried and succeeded in coming to grips with a lot of the problems of his reign. There were things which were out of his control, or that things would have to get worse in some areas before they got better. So like the coinage was debased heavily by him. The Antoninianus dropped from 15% silver in 260 to 2.5% in 268 when he was dead. So the Antoninianus had basically become almost worthless by the end of his reign, and also the copper coinage ceases to exist in terms of mintage. These are all necessary. He has to keep minting coins to pay the army. He's running out of resources. His tax base has been drastically reduced by invasions, posthumous, and rebellions as well. But he's still managing to make it work, and he is effective for the 8 years he has sole rule, and before that, in keeping what's left of the Roman Empire together. I think that his relationship with Odenathus in the East is a good example of that, in that he could have just decided, right, I need to focus all of my attention on this rogue in the East, rather than use him as they both did with each other to their mutual benefit. I don't think he's a great emperor, but he is by far one of the best emperors from this century.
Sure.
And I think he really stands out amongst the Philips and Gordians and so on.